Robert has asked me to give just a brief introduction about the topic and to introduce himself. And I wanted to start out by talking about the experience that I had when I sat in the chairs for the first Foundation Stones presentation back in February. It's been a year now. And I was sitting there as Robert unveiled the foundation stones, and I think it was like slide number 3 or 4. And I was looking at the screen, and my partner at the time, she she gave me this elbow, and she said, "You must talk with Robert after this. This is what you've been talking about for the last 2 or 3 years." And what the foundation stones represent is this incredible synthesis between domains and disciplines, modes of thinking, and the current context of where we are as a society here in the 21st century. And there it was on the screen, and I thought, this is incredible, and I have got to get involved in this, and I've got to pursue this work. And I met Robert. We've known each other now for a year, and he spoke actually last August at the Systems Thinking in Action conference. I invited him to be a keynoter, and his work, it's been watched hundreds of times, and people have shared it, and it's a really incredible piece talking about systems literacy. And systems literacy is, it's really a core competency for the 21st century. And it fits really well into this whole context, which is the word that's going to come up a million times tonight. The whole context of the 21st century. We have incredible speed and rapidity of change, and complexity is growing, and we need to know about systems so that we can get away from kind of event level diagnosis and really get into structures and mental models and paradigms. And this is really the work that Robert's done for 40 years. He's a Princeton trained astrophysicist who, at the height of the environmental revolution, when we were really beginning to understand the impact that we as a society were making on the environment, he decided that, wow, the stars can wait, as he says, but the planet cannot. And so for 40 years, as the founder of Context Institute, he was also editor of In Context magazine, and thus began this incredible, far-ranging exploration of human issues. In fact, Robert would say there are no such thing as sustainability issues. They're only symptoms of human issues. And a massive part of that in the diagnosis and understanding is systems. So that's what we're in for tonight. I'm really excited, not least of which because this is one of my favorite subjects, and I think it's absolutely vital, to introduce Robert Gilman. So would you please put your hands together? Thanks, Chris.
Thanks. Okay, so tonight is systems literacy. And I want to stop here a moment and ask you to get a feel from you about how do you feel when you hear that? I mean, obviously you chose to come tonight. But let me try to do this with some show of hands stuff. How many of you feel really comfortable with the notion of systems? That's pretty good. How many of you feel like you're a little unsure about when you hear the word systems? How many of you feel really confident that you've got systems down? It's just, easy, you've done it. Okay, good. Well, I want to share a little for myself out of this in terms of my relationship with systems. I feel as though I've been immersed in worlds of systems now for a long time. When I was studying and then working as an astrophysicist, astrophysicists deal with systems all the time. So it was kind of the water that I swam in, and I got really very comfortable with it. And then in the 70s, when I discovered the limits to growth work, which is all based on systems material, it was really my introduction to sustainability, and it was a powerful influence on my life. So it's been a territory that I've felt very comfortable with for quite some time. And like many people who feel very comfortable with it, I nevertheless have had my challenges in terms of how to communicate that to other people. Doing this presentation, I hope, will help. It's definitely moved me along in terms of what some of the issues are. I also see that beyond who we are tonight, that for the world as a whole, there are a lot of challenges in terms of people being able to really connect with systems. And so I'm going to try to do what I can to present systems in a way that is as accessible as possible. So let me start with this, that the systems perspective sees parts and wholes equally. That is, there's a lot of zooming in and out from one scale to another that, for me, is really important in the systems perspective. Another is to see both things and relationships equally. And it's easy to see things. It's a little harder to see relationships. So this amounts to giving relationships more credit. And it sees a world filled with connections and patterns and calls those connections and patterns systems. And you will wind up, or you already are, system literate when you can see the world from this kind of systems perspective. I want to emphasize it doesn't take any fancy math. As Chris was saying, nevertheless, it's essential for us in the 21st century. And it's most accessible in terms of being able to see things with a system perspective when you're in your optimal zone, to tie last week's presentation together with this one. Nevertheless, there are challenges in the sense of the systems being mysterious and all of that sort of thing. And I've come to feel that there are a lot of things that feed into those challenges. One of them has to do with the things that are buried deep in our human operating system, and I'll talk a little bit more about those later. But there's also just cultural history, that we haven't had many of the tools that we have now that make it easier to deal with systems. Also, from an empire point of view, where the operating procedure was divide and conquer, you didn't necessarily want people to see on a whole lot of different scales. So there was a lot of resistance, really, to being able to develop good system thinking. And then there's the turf issue. What I find as about a year ago, I got myself on a number of email lists and signed up on various different system-related forums. And what I'm finding is that there are all kinds of different professions that believe they have a monopoly on systems. Or at least they feel that whether it's computer systems or organizational development systems or healthcare systems or family therapy systems or whatever it is, architectural systems, I mean, you go on and on and on. Everybody's got a system. And they tend to look at the world, they tend to look at the use of system as if it's their particular discipline's jargon. And that makes it very confusing for someone coming outside of all that to know what's going on. If you see an ad in the newspaper for a system analyst, what's that supposed to be? At least sometimes it's somebody who organizes computer systems, who figures out what the hardware and software is that you need for your business. Now that seems to me to be a pretty narrow and parochial sense of what system analyst could be. So we run into all of that stuff as well. So I'm going to stand back and ask instead, more broadly, not tied to any one discipline, what is a system? And in keeping with last week, I'm going to emphasize that a system is really a mental construct. It's not something out there. It's a mind pattern. It's a way of organizing our experience And like all of the mind patterns, it's inevitably partial, selective, and provisional. There are no absolute truths in systems. What does the dictionary say? The dictionary says that a system is a set of interacting or interdependent components forming an integrated whole. Sounds really good, and we can think of all kinds of things that will fit that. But when you begin to try to operationalize that, what you find is, well, just what do they mean by component? And what's an integrated whole? Where do I draw the boundaries for that? There's a lot of vagueness in that definition that comes back to bite us. But let me just look at the way that there are all sorts of examples that fit that multiple components into an integrated whole. Things like you. Let's look at you individually as this bundle of subpersonalities. I put an integrator in the center and a witness out here, and then 5 other subpersonalities. You get to pick which ones you want to describe for yourself. But this is a system. This is components forming a hopefully integrated whole. Here's a sentence. Again, you've got components that are interrelated with each other, and they form an integrated whole. Here's the sun. We looked a bunch at the sun last week as an object, but here it is as a system with various different parts and components to it. So is the sun an object, or is it a system? And if it's a system, what are the components of that system? Let me talk a little bit about organizations. We probably know lots of organizations that we could describe as having components, interrelated components, and nevertheless the organization forms an integrated whole. And with economy, you have the economy of your household, the economy of your city or region, the economy of your state or nation, and the economy of the world. Where do we draw the line? What is truly an integrated whole? This brings me to the subject of maps and territories. Because there's an issue that we've been dealing with, trying to work with that definition, that is very much related to this very parallel issue of the confusion between maps and territories. So what's a territory? In the way that I'm using it, a territory is something that is real. It has its own set of characteristics that we can find out by studying, but it also has, who knows how much detail there is to it. Just as last week when we were looking at the question of the sun and discovering that there's all kinds of more depth to what goes on with the sun. Maps, on the other hand, are made by people, and they use selective information about that territory to serve some purpose. And the big thing is that for any single territory, you can have many valid maps serving all kinds of different purposes. The parallel here is that you can have many, many systems, all referring to the same territory. At first that may seem, well, this is confusing. The other side of that is that that's actually very liberating. It means you get to create the system that serves the purpose that you need when you're dealing with any particular territory. So what are the kinds of questions that we can ask of territories? We can ask things like, what are your characteristics? What do you contain? There's a very different set of questions for maps. What is your purpose? You don't ask, what is the purpose of a territory? You may have a purpose for it, but as a natural existing thing, it just is. What simplifications were made in your creation? How accurately do you represent your territory? How effectively do you serve your purpose? These are all questions that are appropriate to ask of systems, as well as of maps. So there wind up being two uses in common language for the word system. And so I'm trying to separate them apart because they get confused. The first is what I'd call system as label. where we talk about the solar system or an ecosystem or the healthcare system, where we're trying to indicate something that's out there in the wider world, and we're doing it in a way that's just pointing to it. That's fine. We can do that, but we can't go very deep with it. Because as soon as we start trying to identify what are the parts and what really is the boundary, we find we get into a lot of personal choices, appropriate personal choices, but you have to make judgment calls. So the other is system as model, used to map the territory. And that's what I'm going to be spending most of the focus on, and that's what I would encourage you to really, if you're going to be serious with systems, understand it as system as model. And it will be a much more powerful tool for you. And among other things, it will give you a competitive advantage among those who are confused between these two uses. Should you want that? It's one of those nice competitive advantages where the more people who actually step into this, the better for all of us. But as long as other people haven't stepped into it, no reason to hold yourself back. So what isn't a system? An object. And not actually the physical ball, but the concept of object is not a system. We think of objects as these bounded, cohesive units. And if we compare objects and systems, well, both of them can be used as labels to point to things in the real world. But the focus of interest is very different. With an object, the focus is out in the boundary. With systems, it's inside the boundary, with what's happening among the parts. Objects wind up being physical. Systems don't need to be. The Constitution is a system. That sentence isn't physical, and it was a system. Cohesive in space. Again, the internet is a system. It's not exactly what you'd call cohesive in space unless you want to take the whole globe as a space. Range of choice in the definition. My sense is that it's easy to come to a common understanding about that thing that I showed before as a ball. Our common sense perceptions lead to a pretty small range of choice in how we define ball. Whereas with systems, there are lots and lots of choices. Now, this is important because one of the huge accomplishments that we made as infants was what's called object permanence, where we first internalized the sense that what we were looking at continued from one time to another time, even if it went away. And it's why Peekaboo is such a universally wonderful game for infants in their first year, because they're just in the process of being able to form the concept of object. It's really powerful, deep, deep in our psyche. It winds up being the metaphor for all of our nouns. Just a great thing. And so we keep wanting to make everything else that's a noun into an object at a subconscious level. And that keeps us with systems trying to make the systems into objects, into things, into something that we can say is out there. So I'm going to take a different tack and offer a definition of a system as a model that's made up of interdependent parts. It has a boundary and a context outside that boundary. And of course, I would want to say that often the context winds up having some really important stuff in it that affects the system. Except for the universe, and we aren't even sure about that, there are no closed systems. Essentially, all systems have some kind of interaction with the wider world around them. In terms of boundaries, I thought this was an interesting case of looking at one boundary in terms of a person's span of control, and then their sphere of influence, and then the context outside of that. Lots of personal choices as to just where you would put those boundaries. And you can have connections that reach across the boundaries. So when you're looking at a system, you're not only looking at what's inside, but you also have to pay some attention to how it connects with what's outside. And nesting. It's important in the systems that we're able to build, construct in our minds, that we're able to group things together and have subsystems and however many layers of systems and subsystems as you want. I also have a sense that the definition I just gave you, I think there are lots of people in the systems world that would agree with that. I'm going to stretch this a little further into what I would offer as kind of a planetary era definition. And that is that a system is an interface between the world and the whole of our brains, helping to bring it to bring to useful order the overwhelming complexity of reality without being stuck with our only 4 chunks of working memory. Has 3 primary aspects. Diagrams, the visual aspect, because we're so good at being able to organize things with the visual parts of our brains. Descriptions, to be able to add on to the various components so that we can bring more depth. So that's the linguistic part. And then often, not always, some kind of dynamics. And I associate those dynamics with the kinesthetic parts of our body. So that with diagrams, descriptions, and dynamics, you're really able to bring in all the various different aspects of who we are. And it's not just personally. If we do this well, we're able to do it in groups. The diagrams are things we can share. The descriptions are things we can share. The dynamics are things we can share. And use it to not only dialogue and serve as an interface with reality, but also to have it a place where we can bring together the various concepts, the various views, the various understandings that each of us have, and build it up into a shared common resource. This is heading us towards something that I'd call community memory or community knowledge.